Folks, this is David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com, your pub chess bluffer, bringing you the latest in the over-the-board action here in Hiroshima in September 2019. Now, I played a game last night against my regular chess opponent in which he opened as white with e4, and whereas I would usually, until this week, have responded to e4 with e6, entering the French defense, I decided to go for something different, based on the reading of a strategic chess opening repertoire for white, in which I've been working with to build a repertoire around d4. And I've come through to the back of the book, which looks at modern defenses, systems with d6 and or g6, in which the d6 opening, or the d6 response to d4, but also here to e4, is called something of a universal. It's sometimes used as a universal first move. Black is willing, he says here, to play the Pirc Defence and various others. It can transpose into many different lines depending on whether black is opened with e4, d4, or something else. But it gave me the idea that I should use d6 to build a repertoire for black, so that I have these two repertoires: an opening repertoire for white with d4 as my opening move, and an opening repertoire for black against pretty much any opening. And you can build that around d6 among other things, but d6 is looking good. One reason I like the look of d6 is because many of the lines in John Watson's book end in equality or uncertainty. And it became clear to me from that analysis, based on an opening around d4, that if you play carefully with black using a d6 based system, you can achieve equality or even better. So I thought I would experiment with it. Earlier this week, I downloaded onto Kindle this book in the Gambit line. Same actually, Gambit is also, they also published the John Watson book. And this one is an explosive chess opening repertoire for black, which is just what you want, I think. And it is by a Finnish grandmaster called Jouni Yrjola and a Finnish international master called Jussi Tella. And their lines, this book has obviously been looked at by John Watson. He refers to it when talking about the modern defense to d4 in his book. So I had a quick look at it. I just downloaded the free sample on Monday, I think. And based on a quick look through that, I thought I'd give this defense a try. I'm not really sure what I'm doing, but I've seen the defense from white's perspective as playing d4, but I've not actually played it as black. So I thought I would give it a try on Wednesday and see how we get on with this new system. And I think I may have surprised my opponent by playing d6 instead of e6 in response to the e4 opening. So without further ado, let's see how things developed. We have d4, and then we have g6. So I'm playing, it says up here, the Pirc Defence. This is actually the modern defence. It can easily go into the Pirc Defence, which we'll have a look at in a minute. But I'll just take us through the first few moves. We then had knight to f3, and here we continue with the modern defense, bishop to g7. And then the fourth move was a fast check, bishop to b5 check. And I was looking at my options. I didn't play either of the two options recommended here. Instead, I brought out my bishop, and my opponent retreated his bishop back to actually a more suitable square for this opening, bishop to c4. Now, I have just been looking through. Today, I decided this book looks pretty good. This explosive repertoire, opening repertoire for black, and so today I purchased the full book, and going through it to look to see if this setup is in the book, and it's not. We're already out of the recommended lines. That's not to say such a line as this doesn't exist. It's just not a line that's followed by our two Finnish chess experts. So we'll go back and see what line they would recommend. It goes like this. No, it doesn't go like that. We immediately goes into knight to f6, second move. Now this is the Pirc Defence here, the knight to f6. And I'll play the next two moves that my opponent played, irrespective of this change. Now he brought his knight out to f3, and this move is not looked at in the book, because presumably because, as you can see already, it gives a nice advantage to white if white were to play this, simply because black can pick up the king's pawn here or can advance his c pawn. But there's a nice free center pawn available here. It looks like it could be gobbled up if white moves like so. The next move is that g6 move, and then if we have this bishop move here, actually it's not too bad, is it, for white? So I'm not sure why it's not mentioned in the book, as I haven't taken my studies very far at all. In fact, I've just given it a fairly casual perusal in preparing for this video. So let's go back to the line that we played through: e4, d6, d4, g6, knight to f3. Then I brought out my bishop. We had that check. I countered with my bishop, and the bishop retreats. So from here, knight to c6, c3, knight to f6. What's quite nice about this game that we played last night, is far from an ideal game, but the percentage of moves that match recommended moves is actually quite high. And also, compared to when I'm playing the French Defence, there is not such a jolting transformation of this bar here. It does happen sometimes, but it's not as violent as it can be when playing the French Defence. If you put a step wrong in the French Defence, quite often, very early in the game, this bar starts jolting around quite a lot. So yes, we have the queen brought out. So here we have a nice recommended move, the e5 move. I do that, and my opponent advances the pawn, and I move my knight to e7. We then both castle, and out comes the bishop to g5. Now this is a fairly common move, even if it's not one of the two recommended moves, but there certainly is this line. Bishop to g5 gets a lot of space. I have already seen in the explosive chess repertoire for black book. So now I'm getting my queen off that bishop line so that my knights are free to move. Probably it's not necessary. The recommended moves are either to immediately attack the bishop with the pawn, or to move your knight to h5. I did eventually move my knight to h5 because this f4 square is a very nice square to target. But anyway, I move my queen over. This knight comes out. The knight goes to d2, and then he's just stopped. The engine has just stopped recommending the move that I made. But if you saw, that little arrow did point to the b5 attack on the bishop, and the bishop retreats. a5. I'm trying to start a pawn storm, but my pawn storm stalls. However, as you can see, I do have a nice small advantage. And this is the thing, I feel, with this setup. I mean, playing the Pirc or a modern defense, is that compared to the problems you can have with the French defense, which is a great defense. I'm still very fond of the French defense, but it looks to me like as if this modern way of playing, this modern defense, is an easier path to equality. So let's have a look. Even if I don't make the recommended move, we're still hanging around the equality level. The bar is not too shocked at these moves of mine. I take with the knight. Yeah, so it's quite interesting that one of the D1 is obviously a good square for rook to occupy, as it's a half open file. White's pawn having disappeared, it's a half open file. It's just that the engine and my opponent disagree about which is the better rook to move there. So now I challenge that. I want to kick that bishop off that diagonal. It probably wasn't a necessary move, but he does move away, which is nice for me. And then I decide to cover. I'm looking at the weaknesses. This queen was looking at this B pawn here, but I also want to keep an eye on this weak pawn here. I have two weak pawns at present. So b3 comes in, knight to b3 that is, and indeed I advance my pawn and the knight goes back to c1 as recommended by the engine. What next? I bring my bishop down to attack the queen. This nice queen rook diagonal here. There is a fairly easy answer, which is to move the bishop, at which point I decide to try to push the other bishop away from in front of the defenses around my king. And indeed, he does move away, and we then get in that knight to h5 move. Better late than never. Now here we have the move back of the bishop, and I then bring this other knight in. So I have my two knights on the flanks, but this is not bad. They're not bad places to be in this particular structure, as far as I can see. We're still hovering around equality, and yeah, the queen doubles on the d file. And so now I grab that pawn, and you can see the major recommendation is to retake with the h pawn. My opponent took with the f pawn, and I was pleased to see that. But it's also interesting that it's not my move is not one of the top two recommendations made by the chess engine. But I thought I'd get my queen in. I'm still keeping my eye on these two pawns. My queen is rather busy in her defensive duties, but gets in a nice check on the king down there on g1. And the king moves to h1. f5. Yeah, this is one move which the machine doesn't like, and it was certainly very dodgy. I felt that I to the extent that I was calculating at all, that I had miscalculated at this point. But things didn't work out too badly in the end. Once again, it's quite interesting. We have this clearly a rook on the e file is recommended, and again it's a different rook that moves. I have got my eye on these two nicely placed pieces for a little pawn fork, which is what I get in. Yeah, this is an interesting move because I was expecting this move here, the bishop exchange, to come in, which then leaves this doubled file here, the queen and the rook looking at my pawn up here, which the queen is still defending. But it didn't happen. We had a bit of a surprise. It was an attack in the other direction. And so, yeah, let's have a look at what would happen if we go the other way with the recommended move. Sorry, let's come back to here. So I advance my pawn, forking the knight and the bishop. Then if we have the recommended move, the engine move, bishop takes c4 check, and then from there the knight takes, attacking the queen. The queen can get in a check, and the king moves off to h7. However, the advantage that I have built up in this position is maintained. But in material terms, white preserves equality of material. For white has 2 knights to my bishop and knight. We both have 6 pawns, and queens and rooks are all present. So here in this situation, although black has built up an advantage, white has at least material equality. And part of the reason for the advantage is this king is vulnerable to attack should the back row clear. Checkmate could come in down on the back row, so you have to go careful in this situation. I think there is a nice opportunity to build a fortification for white here by advancing the pawn to h3 and popping the king in there. But that didn't happen in our game. So let's go back to our game. I have, where have we gone? I moved f. It's going crazy. Where are we now? Where have we gone? Okay, so we advance the pawn, and the bishop takes the pawn takes the bishop, so we're now up 1 minor piece, and the rook takes the pawn. Now, although the engine is giving me this big advantage, it felt a bit hairy for me, sat on the other side of the board. So I brought my rook in, not the recommended move by the engine, to give this pawn some extra protection. And yes, things began to. I felt, although I have an advantage, I felt under some pressure with this move. Looking at my bishop, the queen can come in here now and take this pawn, but I thought I'd bolster the bishop, and the queen did indeed come in and take the pawn. Now this looks bad, but actually, as you can see, my advantage is maintained according to Lichess. And in fact, there is a very strong move which I can make, which we'll come back to in a moment, because I didn't make that move, the queen move, the queen to f2. Instead, I tried to create some other action by sending my knight down, and you can see I just removed my advantage by making what is essentially an irrelevant move. This move of the knight down here, it's irrelevant to the main action on the board. I should have got my queen down into that position, or moved my rook onto this nice open file with the idea of preventing this rook from taking that pawn. So although this is a weak pawn, bolstered up by my rook and my queen, actually white is impeded from simply grabbing that pawn, or would be impeded from grabbing that pawn if my rook is well placed. Now, I was aware that of the king's position on h1, that it was vulnerable to attack, but at the moment I'm thinking that my position looks quite precarious from my perspective playing last night. Again, we're playing these half-hour games with no 30 minutes each on the clock with no increment. So we both had about 10 minutes left at this stage, I think. And so I didn't make that queen move. I sent my knight down on a fairly irrelevant sideshow. And what happens here? It looks like we're both not finding the best moves. Yeah. By advancing the knight to e5, with his eye on taking out this rook here on f7, my opponent has completely blown open the game. It could be, it's practically game over, but I wasn't aware of this. I knew I had a good line, but I wasn't sure that I would be able to get there. However, I decide Not so. I don't even think I can take this knight. Of course, I can take the knight, and I'll show you why in a minute. But I thought I need to bolster my defense down here, with an eye of getting a rook down to this f1 square. So I bring my rook over. It loses me that marvelous advantage I had. So this is the only time in the game where there's those massive swings that we've seen in our other games. And obviously here, I say obviously, it's quite difficult when you're under pressure and time's running low. The knight should take the rook to build up that nice advantage, to build up that attack on the king. But that's not what happened, because instead we had this disaster. My opponent saw that he could double up the queen and the rook against the queen and bring another piece into the attack. My opponent's eyes were glued on that top corner of the board. He could smell victory. He thought he had it. But what he missed, and what I was looking for, was checkmate. Down here, bang. It's a kind of sucker punch right at the end. It's really important when your king can't move on the back row to keep your rook down there guarding that king. So that's how our game ended. It was rather an amusing ending, since my opponent had been attacking and it seemed like he was on the front foot and I was on the back foot. The engine shows us that that's not so. Now I missed this move where the pawn can take the knight. It looks a cursory look at this board, and you'll think, why would the pawn take the knight if this queen can take my queen is undefended, so the queen could just take the queen, couldn't she? Well, actually, no. Here's how it would go. Let's have a look. So d takes e5. D takes e5. You see the engine is not recommending that the queen takes the queen, and let's just do it and see why. So the queen grabs the queen, and now it's game over, because it allows my rook to take that rook. Check. There's only one way to defend against that. Check. You have to bring the queen back, and now black has two options. And I would go for the sure option. If you check by taking the queen, the king has to take, and now the rook can come down, protected by our lovely bishop here, and that is checkmate. So that's one way to go. The other way to do it, if we have this crazy move, is to bring this rook down. And then the queen, either the queen doesn't take it and it's checkmate next go, or well, there may be a sacrificial check up here, but it will be checkmate. Let's just run through that. So this one comes down here, a desperado check up here. We take the knight comes over here, desperate to get something in, and from here, it's pretty much game over. We can either do that or simply take the queen. Let's take that knight so the knight can't get in there. Then the pawn has to move to avoid checkmate, but it's only going to delay it by a little while. We come in here, the king goes up there, and it's going to be game over, isn't it? There we are. That's the end of that. So that's one way to go. In our game, there is quite a rather pretty way of doing checkmate. So I just went for it as soon as I saw it. But the board gave us this rather pretty sort of teasing checkmate. Let's go back to the disaster. So I didn't take I didn't take the knight with my pawn. My opponent takes the pawn. And now, whereas I came straight down here with an immediate checkmate, there is something rather pretty. It's kind of rubbing it in. You can have a nice queen sacrifice, bring the queen down, says check, the king takes the queen, and we still get checkmate like so. So there we are. An enjoyable game and lots of food for thought. I'm very pleased with how things went for black. And I've looked up I've started looking up already this afternoon the move orders for that new D6 explosive opening repertoire for black. So it looks as if I will be recommending opening repertoire for white start with D6, and opening repertoire for black an explosive opening repertoire. It says explosive, but actually the opening seems to me to be a bit quieter than French defence openings. But never mind, it's an explosive chess opening repertoire for black, beginning with D6. Against d4, e4, and all the other options that white can throw at you with his first move. Okay, folks, that's all from me, David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com, your pub chess bluffer, signing out after another exciting encounter over the chessboard here in Hiroshima.